Okay, go ahead.
Does free trade promote economic equality? A problem when trying to answer this question is that in order to understand the effects of trade on economic equality, we must first determine the definitions of the terms that will be used to explain this global issue. Though there are many dimensions to inequality, such as access to power, cultural fulfillment, freedom from violence, in this debate, each debater has agreed that they will focus on the economic variables of real income and consumption. Another challenge these debaters have faced is determining the principal question in regard to inequality is between whom? Is it between countries or between individuals within a country? Both sides have agreed to answer the question pertaining to both circumstances. When discussing the issues surrounding poverty, in this debate, both sides will answer the question pertaining to people who have incomes below the poverty line for international comparisons of $1 a day per head. According to the International Trade Administration, free trade is described as the reduction of trade barriers and the creation of a more stable and transparent trading and investment environment. This makes it easier and cheaper for U.S. companies to export their products and services to trading partner markets. However, in this debate, those arguing the affirmative have agreed that trade is relatively free from official frictions and conducted with a relatively efficient logistics and physical infrastructure. The impact of trade on economic equality is one of the most politically potent and economically compelling issues raised by globalization. Though both sides are not diametrically opposed in their views on this issue, they do in fact offer and represent different perspectives on the impacts of free trade towards economic equality. Arguing in the affirmative, we have debaters Piper and Labari, who will argue that the positive effects of free trade and what it has done to promote economic equality. While arguing the negative, we have debaters Danielle and Ben, who will contest some arguments made by the opposing side, as well as offer solutions to some of the issues at hand. So I'll let them continue.
Okay. Free trade is the most effective way to pursue economic equality. It opens up the market, creating a place for people to sell their goods. It brings more money into the economy, resulting in the ability to charge more for their goods because a broader marketplace, the openness produces growth and productivity. So in order to enhance economic equality, developing countries have to grow more than already developed countries. We strongly believe that the openness will boost developing countries' income. Alan Winters from the University of Sussex states the following: "The economic theory offers many reasons to expect a country's own trade liberalization to stimulate its economic growth. Specializing in goods for which world prices exceed those that would be available at home, reaping economies of scale, and improving performance in the face of new competition, and benefiting from better inputs and technologies available from abroad. In terms of economic inequality, complete equality between countries is unattainable. However, trade liberalization is the most effective option because it will reduce poverty. So looking at the long term, there's clear evidence that free trade does benefit everyone and minimizes and reduces poverty. Regardless of who benefits more or less, 6 to 7 years of an open market, poverty is reduced. Free trade increases competition, so in the short term, some people may suffer. Companies would then have to work harder to keep up with their competition. However, we must alleviate the hardship of the people who lose in the short term by having social safety nets and job retraining rather than by simply abandoning reforms. There have been many examples of countries that have opened their economy and have achieved economic prosperity. Such countries include Chile, Botswana, Korea, and Mauritius. All of these countries have grown from very low levels of income and have all opened up their economies pretty strongly. We firmly believe that trade liberalization is the best option to strengthen economic equality. The World Trade Organization concluded in a Secretariat study stating trade liberalization is generally a strong, positive contributor to poverty alleviation. It allows people to exploit their productive potential, assists economic growth, curtails arbitrary policy interventions, and helps to insulate against shocks. Looking at the long term, trade liberalization will reduce poverty and benefit the larger majority.
Money can't buy happiness? Surveys say otherwise, as they've shown that income
decisive role in constructing how content people are. In fact, inequality plays a role in the lives of many. Studies have shown that people are happy when their earnings are high, but are even happier when their earnings are higher when comparing them to others. Though income disparity is a topic of much debate, it is important to understand that while equality is good, forcing it can be counterproductive for the reason that there is no incentive to work. With a stable income equal to everyone else's, there is no fuel to be innovative or work harder. This is a commonly accepted notion. However, inequality is just as counterproductive. Those who are wealthy receive privileges that poor people can't afford, which in turn makes disgruntled workers in different fields of the labor market, decreasing productivity. This is more prevalent in poor countries where markets are less developed. Another aspect of inequality is that with a wide income gap between the rich and the poor, there is no middle class, which gives room for bribery and influential connections for the wealthy. The political and economic world are susceptible to an unfair balance favoring the elite, while those without money are too focused on surviving day-to-day life and lack the means to be able to demand change and transparency in their governments. In theory, opening a country's economy to trade would increase that country's income. This has only worked in a few countries. Countries in Latin America and Africa have yet to reap the benefits of trade liberalization because certain exceptions exist. The first is that unusual pre-existing conditions exist. The second is that there is a lack of people to do the job, lack of financing, or access to broader markets that encourage diversification. Without diversification, economic growth slows in the long run, and closing off industry to trade only loses money. So how would a country develop a manufacturing base? Investing in education and health programs provides a strong labor force. Reducing corruption through a good justice program is also necessary. This should theoretically work, but in the real world, the countries with the most productive assets get stuff done. Take Nigeria and the US, for example. 100 workers can produce more widgets in 1 hour in the US than in Nigeria because of the frequent power cuts in Nigeria, high transportation costs, poor infrastructure, etc. These factors detract foreign investment from developing countries to developed countries, creating markets that receive more foreign capital than others. Another source of inequality is environmental degradation. Powerful companies can move their production base to countries where environmental regulation is weak, which is usually in poor countries. This disproportionately targets the poor because they don't have the influence to get their government to support them.
In your World Trade Secretariat study published in June 19 finds that trade liberation helps poor countries to catch up to rich ones, and that the faster economic growth helps to alleviate poverty. WTO Director General Mike Moore said this report confirms that although trade alone may not be enough to eradicate poverty, it is essential if poor people are to have any hope of a brighter future. For example, 30 years ago, South Korea was as poor as Ghana. Today, thanks to trade-led growth, it is as rich as Portugal. Dan David of Tel Aviv University and Ellen Winters of Success University studies finds that in general, living standards in developing countries are not catching up with those in developed countries. But some developing countries are catching up. What distinguishes them is their openness to trade. The countries that are catching up with rich ones are those that are open to trade, and the more open they are, the faster they're converging. So a good example is in Africa, Mauritius, one of the most open economies in sub-Saharan Africa, exemplify how trade can be a strong instrument for achieving the MGD. In traditional exports, such as sugar and textile, have been sustained by trade policies that have allowed the country to adapt to international competition and develop value-added service. Mauritius' GDP growth reached an impressive average of 6% a year after implementing an export-oriented strategy in 1996. Other successful initiatives have been initiated in Rwanda, where coffee export have fueled economic development, and also in Kenya, where cut flour export have seen a growth rate of 35% annual over the last 15 years, sustained by trade incentive. So, that's pretty much it.
There's no doubt that liberalizing trade benefits the economic growth of certain countries, but at the same time, however, in other countries, it could promote social, political, and economic inequality within countries that makes them not able to successfully place a foothold in the globalized trade economy that's going on today. And developing countries specifically have trouble gaining economic strength because they don't have the resources to make investment plans in order to benefit themselves. And this can end with the promotion and increase of inequality, because while developed countries can gain economic wealth through trade, developing countries are stuck at the bottom, not being able to rise in the ranks. And there's no direct evidence that claims trade liberalization is the only reason for an increase in inequality. There is, however, that solid evidence can prove free trade plays an important role, like overall in the end, and it can affect each country differently based on the economic stability that before trade liberalization came into play. For example, Chile liberalized trade in 1974, and the goal was to decrease wage inequality within the country. But in the end, the reaction to trade liberalization caused the education system to get privatized, which ended up increasing the inequality inside the country because it excluded many lower class citizens from the possibility of schooling, leaving them stuck in the lower class and not being able to move up. And Mexico as well coincided the removal of certain policies that favored lower skilled workers and the protection of low wage industries during the liberalization of their trade. And this in time lowered the wages of lesser skilled workers and increased the wages of more skilled workers. In time, increased the inequality within the country because more skilled workers were rising while lower skilled workers were just staying or almost decreasing. And trade liberalization will affect every country differently. It all depends on what economic standpoint the country is in beforehand, before it comes into play. And more times than not, in developing countries, which is most of the world, it will end negatively and have an increase in inequality within the country, and then increase equality globally overall, because that country can't rise.
So you can see the faults of trade liberalization when you look at a situation where the government doesn't step in to push the countries in the right direction. In order for countries to strive in an open market society, they need to have the infrastructures, reasonably flexible labor and capital markets, and corporate regulations that allow new firms to emerge, as well as decent port facilities and administration to allow goods to get in and out. Some argue with free trade, governments can lose revenue from the lack of tariffs. However, the total revenue is provided by trade taxes, which is higher for the poor countries than for the rich ones. This potentially becomes a major issue at low levels of economic development. What about this sounds like economic equality? Other scholars argue that because of free trade, trade between rich and poor countries systematically benefits the rich countries and harms the poor ones. While obviously the experience of different countries will vary in detail, we argue that there is no hard evidence to support that theory. Evidence does in fact suggest that once we make allowance for the fact that policies are generally better in rich countries than in poor countries tend to grow a bit faster. They catch up, therefore reducing inequality. Another argument is that trade liberalization increases skill gap and generally raises inequality, especially within a country. These arguments vary from case to case, but with sufficient information, we can predict some of the effects, which is useful for designing policies to support trade liberalization. Where unskilled labor is abundant, the goods it produces will be plentiful and therefore relatively cheap in the absence of international trade. When trade is opened up, the goods will be exported and generally relieve poverty. In many Latin American and African countries, there are lots of natural resources, and liberalization will stimulate these sectors rather than labor-intensive ones. So having an active redistribution policy will help the poor obtain access to the land, skills, and markets. Now in the short term, some people may suffer due to the increase in competition. However, like I said before, we can reduce these issues by creating social safety nets and job retraining rather than by abandoning reforms. Long term, as in 6 to 7 years, trade liberalization is beneficial. With these following reasons, it is evident that free trade is the best option to boost equality and ultimately reduce poverty.
As I previously mentioned, income disparity is prevalent between developed and developing countries. I'm not saying that blocking trade is a solution to bridging economic problems existing today, but a winner-take-all strategy is also not going to solve the problems that different countries see, since they're facing different conditions that impact how policies affect them. Once a developing country opens its market and sees its income rise, the parties with increased earnings should compensate their poorer counterparts. That way, everyone benefits from income rises. Speaking on an individual level, traders and investors would be the people who benefit happily from trade liberalization. It is easy to forget about the little people who help them acquire their wealth. Through building infrastructure and working to extract raw materials, though this counts as unskilled labor, they provide the building blocks for a country to physically function. Another thing to take into account is that with trade, the diversification of the economy quickly follows. This means that different sectors are available within a country, meaning that diversification brings jobs. Without money, however, the country's poor have little to no access to information about the different areas in the economy where they can work and are therefore susceptible to the problems of difficult transitions. Unfortunately, it does not always work this way. The day these hypotheticals work would be the day we could finally see some real changes in combating poverty. One reason this doesn't work is that countries aren't met with liberalization policies that allow them to redistribute their earnings. With little to no money, a country's citizens lack the influence necessary to hold their government accountable in equalizing the economic playing field. Senegal, for example, had a hard time allocating money to the most sensitive groups in its country, and instead spent it on privileged groups. Urban and rural families had no protection from the ever-changing economy. A fair and sustainable fix to these problems would be making sure that reforms such as food voucher systems and work training programs actually get funded by governments because they benefit the masses in the long run.
You made some very solid points, but over time, free trade does increase economic prosperity in the long run. Just the short-term damage it does, however, by increasing the inequality, not only within the country, but within the globalized economy, can be more harmful and have more destructive potential than the long-term benefits a country will eventually obtain. And trade will affect everyone's income differently, which is why it's inaccurate to make the claim that free trade has increased economic prosperity and equality for everyone. For example, when the North American Free Trade Agreement came into effect, a manufacturer said it was able to close a factory in Canada and open one in South Carolina, putting 300 Canadian workers out of work and employing 800 Americans. And this happens all the time, which causes one group to benefit from free trade and another group to get negatively affected by trade liberalization at the same time. And when people lose jobs and become unemployed, it causes the inequality within the country to increase greatly. It seems to have somewhat of like a domino effect, because trade liberalization may not be the direct cause of inequality itself, but it can affect other things, which in the end can increase the already existing inequality the country has.
Okay, so to wrap up, because I know we're running out of time. So according to the affirmative, free trade is the most effective way to pursue economic equality. Not only will trade liberalization increase income in developing countries, but it is also the most effective option because it will reduce poverty through high competition and in the international market, and therefore result in economic growth. Now, those who are arguing the negative agree that free trade benefits economic growth of developed countries. However, in developing countries, this can, and I quote, contribute to social, political, and economic inequality. Now we ask you, is economic equality an achievable goal, or will the effects of free trade be too much for developing countries to overcome? Thank you.